By way of illustration, if you could envision a successful business, maybe that had grown quite large and was just become a household name for decades, but as businesses oftentimes do, the society, the culture changes, and maybe that business begins to struggle in some ways. Profits are down, and the board of directors of that company begin to discuss and try to figure out what can we do to change things up, what can we do to make this successful again. And while some people are nervous about it, and they're kind of a little worried, there's sort of that assumption, well, as big as this company is, it's bound to come back again. It's bound to do well again. It's just sort of a matter of time. Maybe we need to make some tweaks, but that board of directors kind of takes a pretty bold and risky move, and they fire the longtime CEO of that company, and they hire an outsider, somebody who isn't at all committed to or loyal to the culture of that company and all of the things that had become a part of that company. This outsider is willing to reimagine them and do them quite differently. And so he does change some things quite significantly. Now, how do you imagine the employees of that company would respond to that CEO coming in making significant changes? I imagine it would be an array of responses. I imagine that there would be some who were already critical of the company that they worked for, and so they welcomed changes, and they were kind of cheering on the idea of making changes and doing things differently. And then I imagine that there's probably the majority of the workers there who are somewhat open-minded. They're kind of skeptical. Let's just kind of see how things go. Let's see. Some changes are maybe good, others not quite sure, but in the end, we'll just kind of wait and see how things play out. And then I'm sure that there would be a segment, maybe particularly those who were in leadership positions within that organization, those who helped to bring about some of the cultural ways of doing things, who would feel like this was an attack on them, like the very things that they helped to imagine, the things that they helped to bring about, the very things that they thought were needed are now being criticized and torn down and replaced, and they would feel like this is an attack on them, and they behind the scenes would probably fight that new CEO. They would hope that CEO was unsuccessful so that they would be proven to have been right, that the things that they thought were necessary would be shown to be important and valuable. I think that this illustrates the way that Judaism responded to Jesus when he came. Judaism was sort of like this large, complex household name business that in Israel everyone knew about it, and I think people in general knew that there needed to be some changes, that the leadership structure, the system itself had gotten the nation in trouble, that there were plenty of times in their past, and even at the time when Jesus showed up and came, that as a nation they weren't doing all that well because there was plenty of corruption to go around. That the Pharisees, the religious leaders, were known at times to be hypocritical. And so there was certainly enough criticism thought toward them. And so a lot of people assumed that when the Messiah would come, that he would bring about reform of some sort, that he would change some things, that he would tweak the system, if you would, that he would alter some things. But as we're going to see, Jesus didn't just come to be a reformer. He didn't just come to reform the system and bring some tweaks. He actually came to completely transform it. In fact, my thesis this morning would be this, that Jesus came to replace Israel's religious system, not with a new and improved system, but with himself. That he came to replace the system with a person. And he is calling people not to follow a new system, but to follow him. A person. And this is something that particularly the religious leaders push back against. This is a step too far. And I think it's important for us to realize, this is something I've been thinking about the past several weeks, that, when we read the Gospels, if you've grown up in church at all, or if you've spent any time as a Christian and you've read the Gospels, we come sort of with a preloaded lens that tells us Jesus is the good guy and anybody that opposes him is the bad guy. Everything Jesus says is good and right and true, and anything that is pushing against what Jesus says is obviously bad. And that's true. I'm not suggesting that's not true. But what I'm suggesting is that the people that lived through these events, the people that were there at the time, they didn't have this clear-cut black and white system to interpret everything by. They didn't look at Jesus and immediately know everything he says is true and perfect and right. So they're weighing what he says. Is this true? Is this not true? And they're trying to balance it against a whole bunch of assumptions that their culture taught them to bring to bear. And Jesus is pushing back against some things that they had always assumed were good and right and holy and things that you shouldn't push against. And Jesus is pushing against them. So, they're weighing this. They're struggling against a lot of what Jesus says. I mean, on the one hand, Jesus is performing these amazing miracles. He's doing really good things, healing sick people, casting out demons. At the same time, he's making some really wild claims. He seems to be claiming to be God himself. I mean, this man, Jesus, seems to be asserting that he's God or that he has the authority of God and he can just speak for God and he can forgive people's sins and he can say this is what is true and this is what is not true. He doesn't seem to speak with the kind of humility that you would assume a human would speak with. Well, I might be wrong, but I think... No, he spoke with this authority that on one hand was kind of appealing. On the other hand, it could be off-putting if you disagreed with him. He also did things that were very scandalous. I mean, he associated with Samaritans and even Gentiles. He ignored prohibitions against unclean and clean at times. He violated Sabbath norms, which were thought of as the Sabbath laws. He seemed to set them aside at times. And as we'll see this morning in the passage we'll look at, he associates with some of the worst members of society. He sits down and parties with them, and he ignores some well-established religious practices in the context this morning in relation to fasts. And so this is confusing. The people that want to be good disciples, the people that want to be good Jews are trying to wrestle with this Jesus individual and what he says and teaches. And they're trying to figure out, is he right? Is he wrong? Is he somewhat right? What do we do with this? And so in the passage this morning, we'll see that, for some, Jesus was frankly too liberal. He was too liberal for some in his day. But Jesus has a reason for doing the things that he's doing. And what I think we'll see in the two scenarios this morning is that Jesus is confronting religious elitism. The religious elitism in his day, he's confronting it. And he does that by way of two questions that are posed to him. And these two questions fit together. It's important to read them together, as we'll see this morning. And, these questions were very likely didn't come up at the same time. It's two different groups who pose these questions. The first question is posed to him by Pharisees. The second question is posed to him by some disciples of John. But Matthew, and through the Holy Spirit, puts them together to make a unified point. The point that this passage is teaching us, these two questions kind of help to round out the main point that Jesus is trying to make. And so the first question that we see, if you've got outlines and you want to follow along the outline there in the bulletin or on the church app, or if you just want to write down in your own notes from the PowerPoint, however you want to do it is fine. But the first point that we're going to see is we're going to look at a question about feasting, which revealed Jesus' new attitude toward relational ministry. Jesus is going to be asked a question related to his feasting, and it is going to reveal his new attitude, or the new attitude that he brings toward relational ministry. Look at Matthew chapter 9 and verse 9. It says, as Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, follow me. And he rose and followed him. Now, I know a lot of you have heard enough stories to know this, but in case this isn't something you're familiar with, the tax collectors in Jesus' day were about the least popular people in all of society. We don't like the IRS. We don't like tax collectors because it means that we owe money. And that was part of why the tax collectors in Jesus' day were despised, but it was much bigger than that. The tax collectors represented the arm of the Roman government, and the Roman authorities and the Roman government were despised by the people because they were seen as just taking advantage and oppressing them. They were basically enslaving them, and one of the ways that they did that, at least enslaving them fiscally, financially, is they didn't let anybody get wealthy because they took a lot of money. They overtaxed them. They burdened them with taxes. And so they would use Jews, they would use their own countrymen. The Romans would come in and they would find people who were willing to function as the tax collector of the people. And the people that did it then, were basically the only people they could hang out with were other tax collectors. Nobody liked them. Nobody wanted to be their friends, but they did it because it was lucrative and they could make a lot of money. It paid well, but they were also somewhat free to just overtax people. And so not only did the people hate them because they were viewed as the arm of the oppressive Roman government against them, but they knew that these people, for their own benefit, were taking advantage of them, were even overtaxing them and then pocketing them. It'd be like in our day, the corrupt governor who comes in and 2 years after he's in government, somehow he's a multi-millionaire. And everybody knows he's doing a pay-to-play scheme behind the scenes where if you want to do business with him and the state government, you have to bribe him. And so he's driving around in his really fancy car and living in his fancy mansion, and you know how he's got his money. You just kind of don't like this guy. It would be like Jesus coming along and you're watching him and he goes up to that guy, the corrupt politician, and says, "Hey, come be one of my inner disciples." This exalted cultural position of a disciple, of a rabbi in the making, and he's asking one of the worst of society. Immediately you're thinking, what is going on here? And so with that in mind, it's important also that we understand this story in light of the stories that have come right before this. In Matthew 8 and 9 so far, I've said that, this is a unit in Matthew's gospel. You've got these various miracles followed by some teaching about discipleship, and there's a whole bunch of points of comparison or contrast with this story that on the surface might sort of, as you're just reading through, you might feel like it just sort of stands on its own, but there's all these points of contact that we, the readers, are supposed to be making to chapter 8 and the beginning of chapter 9. So let me draw out a few of those for you. Back in Matthew chapter 8, verses 19 and 20, you have a scribe, a religious leader who apparently comes to Jesus and says, "I will follow you." He's like volunteering to be one of Jesus' disciples, and Jesus' response seems to be somewhat almost dismissive and discouraging of him following him. It's like, foxes have dens, birds of the air have a nest. I don't even have anywhere to lay my head. In other words, are you really sure you want to be my disciple? Because the cost is probably more than you realize and probably more than you're willing to incur. Maybe you want to rethink that. He's kind of discouraging it. And so you've got this scribe, this religious leader who volunteers to be Jesus' disciple, and Jesus is kind of like, eh. And then you've got Matthew, the tax collector, and Jesus initiates a conversation with him. "Hey, Matthew, come and be my disciple." And so as the reader, you're like, what is this? Jesus is sort of about religious leaders who want to follow him, but a tax collector, he goes out of his way to invite. What's up with that? Then you have this other, I think, contrast in Matthew 8 and verse 21. You have a second guy described as a disciple who comes up to Jesus and says, "I will follow you wherever you go, but let me first go and bury my father." And Jesus says, "Let the dead bury the dead, but you must come and follow me." He's basically saying, if you're really going to be a disciple, I need to be first priority. You can't have other priorities first. You really need to make sure that you want to follow me and leave behind whatever other things might be in the way. Here, he comes to Matthew, who has a lucrative job, says, "Come and follow me," and immediately he gets up and leaves and follows him. Luke's gospel is more direct. Luke's gospel explicitly says he got up and left it all behind and followed Jesus. And so again, you have an example of one who seems to be a religious guy, a disciple, who says he wants to follow Jesus, but he doesn't actually seem to be willing to pay the cost involved. by prioritizing it. And then you've got Matthew, the worst of the worst in the Jewish mind, who immediately gets up, leaves it all behind to follow Jesus. And so you've got sort of on display an important contrast going on here about what discipleship really looks like. There's at least one more contrast that I want to point out, and that is at the end of Matthew chapter 8 and verse 34. Jesus has gone to this town, this Gentile town. He's cast out demons, and then a whole bunch of pigs died. And the financial outlook of the town definitely took a step back because of this miracle. And the townspeople all come out to meet Jesus. They've all heard about the great miracle he did. And the resounding response, collective response from the town is, Jesus, please leave us alone. There's this reticence to want to risk more financial upheaval as the cost of following Jesus. But Matthew, a wealthy guy, he's wealthy because of his sinful, corrupt career, immediately leaves all of that behind to follow Jesus. He's not concerned about the financial impact that this will definitely have on him. And so Matthew serves several important points of contrast the one who's writing this gospel is telling his own story. His own story serves as an important foil or contrast to some of the things that has been building up to this story in the previous couple of chapters. Now let's keep reading verses 10 through 13. And as Jesus reclined at table in the house, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" But when he, Jesus, heard it, he said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, for I came not to call the righteous, but sinners." Notice, not only does he call and invite this tax collector Matthew to be one of his disciples, but this immediately evolves into Jesus and his disciples all sitting at probably Matthew's house. It is not quite explicit, but that seems to be implied. At Matthew's house with a whole bunch of other tax collectors, corrupt people, and sinners. And they're all having a big party together. And the Pharisees are naturally saying, what is going on? This guy's supposed to be some great religious leader, and he's associating and having a big party with the worst of society. What is going on here? Now, I think there's another point of connection that I want you to see and draw, and that goes back to Matthew chapter 8, verses 1 through 4. And in that context, Jesus comes in contact with a leper, a man with leprosy, and he touches him and makes him whole. And we talked in that message, if you were here with us, about how leprosy in many ways was a metaphor for sin. There's a whole bunch of points of connection that you can see if you think about it, of how leprosy can represent sin. And just the whole concept of the unclean versus clean in the Old Testament was a broad picture of sin and how sin makes us unclean. And you have to be careful about touching it because it tends to spread. But Jesus was unafraid to come into contact with leprosy because leprosy didn't affect Jesus. Jesus didn't become unclean even in a ceremonial sense. On the contrary, he made this man clean. And here you have a similar principle playing out now with actual sinners. Jesus is unafraid to associate with the worst of the worst, with the sinners. He's not worried about how they're going to impact him or influence him because he is the one who's doing the influencing. He is going to help make them clean. Now, before we're too critical of the Pharisees and the religious folks who would have looked at Jesus and said, "What are you doing hanging out with these people?" There was plenty of things in the Old Testament that warned about associating closely with wicked people. Especially in the wisdom literature in the Old Testament, there was a lot of warnings about not associating with the wicked and making wise people your friends, your companions. Here's just a brief handful of those. Psalm chapter 1 and verse 1, "Blessed is the one who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, who stands not in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers." It's like, you're blessed if you don't get close and associate with wicked, foolish people. Psalm 119:63, David says, I am a companion of all who fear you, of those who keep your precepts. The people that are my friends are the people who love your law. Proverbs 13 and verse 20, whoever walks with the wise becomes wise, but the companion of fools will suffer harm. Again, it's urging people to make friends with people who are wise because you're going to become like the people you spend time with. And don't get too close or spend too much time with fools because you're going to become a fool if you do. Similarly, Proverbs 14:7, leave the presence of a fool, for there you do not meet words of knowledge. And finally, Proverbs 28:7, the one who keeps the law is a son with understanding, but a companion of gluttons shames his father. If you hang out with people that just kind of party and are gluttons and drunkards and things, you're going to shame your father. Don't do that. So it's understandable that the Pharisees would look at Jesus who's doing this and says, this is unconventional. This doesn't look like what we would think a righteous person would look like. And even just the food laws, the Mosaic law had a whole bunch of rules about what kind of food Jews could and couldn't eat, what kind of meats they could and couldn't eat. And a lot of the laws that God put over his people were explicitly given to them so that it would create distinctions between them and the Gentiles, so that non-Jews could easily be distinguished from Jews. But beyond that, I don't know if you've thought about this, but the food laws in particular had as a natural consequence the reality that it all but prevented Jews from having table fellowship with Gentiles. It was pretty hard to sit down at a meal and just, Jews and Gentiles get together and eat if you were going to be true to those laws, because almost certainly something that's going to be put before you is something you're not allowed to eat, and you're going to have to say, I can't have that. And so one of the results of the food laws was essentially to say you need to guard who you eat with, because you're going to become like the people you have table fellowship with. And so Jesus, these are not pagans in the true sense. These are likely Jewish people, but they're not law-observant Jews. These are sinners. These are tax collectors. These are people who aren't real Jews in the spiritual sense. And Jesus is sitting down and he's eating and partying with them. Now, Jesus explains himself, and he gives, three reasons, if you would, or it's kind of all interrelated, but he gives, his answer is rooted in three things. The first is this. His answer is rooted in just a point of logic. In verse 12, Jesus says, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. So look, I'm a physician. I'm a doctor. And that means I'm going to be around sick people. If you're a hypochondriac, you probably shouldn't try to become a doctor, right? If you're worried about getting sick and you're always concerned about not getting what somebody else has, you're kind of like, oh, germs, stay away. If that's how you think and that's how you're wired, you probably shouldn't go into the medical field. That wouldn't make any sense, because by definition, if you're a doctor, your role is to heal people or help people who are sick, which means you're going to see a lot of sick people. You're going to be around a lot of sick people. Jesus is saying, I'm a physician. I'm here to help heal people. Of course, I'm going to associate with sick people. And I think we see another connection here then. Again, the connections just keep building between this portion and the earlier portions, because in the earlier portions, Jesus does a lot of miracles. Several of them are healing sick people. And I made the point before that the healing of the sick was a metaphor in many ways of the great sickness, which is our sin. This especially was seen in the story of the paralytic, where he came for healing and Jesus responds with, "You're forgiven of sin." But I think that really comes together here because Jesus, describing himself as the physician, the healer, the true sickness is sinners. Sin is the real sickness. It's the real contagion that we need to address. And Jesus, as the great physician, ultimately needs to associate with the sinner in order to heal the sin problem. I mean, frankly, just the fact that Jesus came into this world was Jesus associating with sinners. The story of Christmas is the story of Jesus, God, being born as a human into a world full of sinners. Jesus becoming one of us so that he can save us, so that he can be around us. Secondly, Jesus says that his answer, we see, is rooted in Scripture. Jesus says, go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. Now we hear I desire mercy and not sacrifice, and unless we really know the Old Testament well, or unless we see the little note in our Bibles that that has a little number and you look in the margin, oh, this is from Hosea 6:6, we probably don't realize that Jesus is quoting from the Old Testament here, but that's what he's doing. He's quoting a line from the prophet Hosea, and he's telling the Pharisees, go and learn what this means, which commentators tell us that this was a way that a teacher would talk to his students, basically saying, you haven't yet learned this. You need to go and study this more and learn this. Go and learn what this means. This would have been felt as an insult to the Pharisees. Jesus is saying, you obviously don't understand these Old Testament scriptures. You need to go and study this more. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, the I being God. Now, if you're familiar with the story of Hosea in the Old Testament, the story of Hosea, the prophet was to take a wife, and this wife was going to be unfaithful to him time and time again. And she was going to serve as a metaphor for Israel, who was unfaithful to God time and time again. And so in Hosea chapter 6, God is explaining to the nation what he desires of them and how they are to get right with him. And he says, look, I desire, at least in the ESV, it says love. I desire love, not sacrifice. And you might read that and assume it means I want you to love me rather than make sacrifices for me. But in the Septuagint, in the Greek translation, it says I desire mercy and not sacrifice. Another way to translate a similar word that's used there. And as such, the way Jesus uses it here, it seems to imply that it means I desire to have mercy or love toward you rather than to expect you to sacrifice for me. That God is saying the way you get right with me isn't by me sitting back and waiting for you to do a bunch of sacrifices until you've finally pleased me enough and then I'm willing to take you back. It's rather by you responding to my mercy. That I show you grace. That's how you get right with me. Jesus is going to quote this verse again a couple chapters later in Matthew in a very similar context. He seems to be saying to the Pharisees, your attitude towards the wicked is, yeah, they can come to Jesus as long as they're willing to demonstrate their sincerity enough by making enough sacrifices and doing enough good things to show that they've changed and that they're better people, and then we can associate with them and then God will accept them. And Jesus is saying, no, God desires to be merciful and gracious to sinners, and that's how he woos them to himself. And so I'm going to love these people. I'm going to treat them with grace and kindness and mercy. I'm not going to expect them first to sacrifice, and then I'll accept them or love them, because that's the heart of God. Thirdly, then, and again, this is related to the first one, but Jesus' answer is rooted in mission. Verse 13, for I came not to call righteous or the righteous, but sinners. I didn't come to call the righteous ones, but I came to call the sinners. And there's obviously some intended sarcasm here, because by righteous, he doesn't actually mean people that are genuinely righteous. He means the people who think that they're righteous, the people who don't think that they need him because they already are righteous enough. Jesus is like, I didn't come to spend all of my time with the people that already view themselves as being really good people who don't really need me. I came to spend my time targeting the people who know that they're sinners, who know that they need salvation, they need healing. And the reality of this, just to stop and think about the implication of, when we think about who we are, or when we think about, how do we view ourselves, we are all the sinners and tax collectors. Some of us know it and some of us don't. That's the distinction. Some people think that they're righteous and others know that they're not. To be his disciple is first and foremost, like Matthew, to recognize I'm one of the sinners. I need this one. That's why I'm going to follow him. He's calling me to follow him, not because I'm so good and because he needs more people like me. It's because I'm so bad and I need him. That's the point of the invite, to come and follow me. And then beyond that, genuine disciples, we begin to sense here, Jesus is trying to make the point to the religious elites of his day. Genuine disciples of Jesus will have a desire for the lost even the worst of sinners. We're not looking for others to sacrifice enough to be worthy of the gospel or to be worthy of church or to be worthy of our friendship. They need Jesus, and so we're to take him to them. I've mentioned my wife when she grew up, her pastor, Pastor Jeff, worked at the Pacific Garden Mission as his full-time job, and so he came into contact with a lot of people who had come off the streets, had addictions in their background, crime in their background, and they would sometimes trust Christ as for salvation, and then they would go through the program there at the Pacific Garden Mission, and then when their time would come to an end, then it was time for them to somehow transition into, becoming a contributing member of society, if you would, and that was a hard transition for many of them to make. Where do they go and live? They didn't always have a natural place to live and go, and so he regularly had people that he and his wife would invite to live with him who had shady backgrounds. And you can imagine that's a risky thing to do. That's risky to invite people with those sorts of backgrounds to come into your house, especially when you have 4 kids that you're raising. And some of those were success stories, and some of them weren't. He had people steal from him who didn't pan out, and then you'd have others, and they'd revert back to drugs or whatever their previous life was. But you'd have some that did. You had some success stories in that. But in many ways, he illustrated a heart of someone who was willing to take risk for the cause of the gospel. He was willing to do hard things and give up some of the safety that maybe most of us would be inclined to want to build into our life, and sort of the self-protection that the Pharisees seem to be intent on here. I don't want to get too close to those people. I don't want them to infect me. I don't want them to affect me negatively. I don't want to be harmed by them. And Jesus is pushing back and saying, to be a follower of me requires some risk. That the mission of the gospel involves a level of getting close to the undesirables. And it's a lot easier when we realize that we are the undesirables. Now, this leads into the second question that is posed to Jesus. The first was a question about his willingness to feast with these sinners, but then the second one is a question about fasting, which is going to reveal Jesus' new approach to religious piety. A question about fasting revealed Jesus' new approach to religious piety. Look at verses 14 through 17. It says, "Then the disciples of John came to him saying, 'Why do we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?' And Jesus said to them, 'Can the wedding guests mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast. No one puts a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch tears away from the garment, and a worse tear is made. Neither is new wine put into old wineskins. If it is, the skins burst, and the wine is spilled, and the skins are destroyed. But new wine is put into fresh wineskins, and so both are preserved.'" Now, as I said earlier, this question and this answer needs to be put side by side with the previous one. These two questions are interrelated in certain ways. On the surface, as my points highlight, they both have to do with eating. On the one question, there's a question about why Jesus does eat in certain ways, and then the second question is why he and his disciples fail not to eat in certain ways. Like, why do you feast like this? And the second one is, why don't you fast? Why are you partying? Why aren't you fasting? Is kind of the point. To Jesus, food seems to be an opportunity to have a good time with people and show them that they matter, show them that he cares about them, for fellowship and joy and celebration. For the Pharisees and the disciples of John the Baptist, food was an opportunity to sacrifice, to show how committed and devoted they were to Judaism, to show how committed and devoted they were to God. They were willing to give up food. They were willing to hunger. And what we know from the scholars is that most observant Jews The most committed Jews at this time would typically fast 2 days a week. Interestingly, the Old Testament only ever commands one fast 1 day a year on the Day of Atonement. But as religious people of that day had done, there's a whole bunch of other traditions and trappings and sort of this Jewish culture that had arisen. And so devoted Jews by this time just assumed that if you're really devout, you're going to fast twice a week, these 2 particular days a week that people would fast. This is likely what they have in mind. In fact, maybe the day that Jesus was partying with these sinners was a day when they were fasting. And so they're kind of asking about it later. Hey, why? Why are you guys feasting like this? In fact, why aren't you fasting? I mean, the Pharisees and the religious leaders, the people who are really devoted, and we, the disciples of John the Baptist, we fast. Well, your disciples don't even fast. What's up with that? Jesus, as I said before, had given the answer, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. They're concerned about sacrifice. They're rejoicing in the fact that they are willing to sacrifice eating 2 days a week to show their devotion to God. Jesus and his disciples apparently aren't willing to sacrifice because they don't fast. In fact, they're living it up. They're eating like gluttons almost. They're partying with a bunch of sinners. And as Jesus has already said in his response to the first question, God desires mercy and love be shown more than he desires that we make some great sacrifice for him. Do you understand that? That true religious piety has less to do with how many sacrifices you make for God and how strict of a lifestyle you adhere to, and it has more to do with how well you love other people. This is the point that these 2 stories, I think, are trying to make when read together. Now, Jesus' answer, he gives, really 3 things. The second 2 go together, but the first one, he says, can wedding guests fast when the bridegroom is with them? He's asking a basic question. He's like, look, if you went to a wedding, and weddings in that day, the celebration typically lasted a full week, are you going to fast 2 of the days of that week-long wedding just so you can show your devotion? Or are you going to set your fast aside so that you can participate with the wedding if you're one of the wedding guests? It's unsure whether he's referring to the guests of the wedding or to the groomsmen. Either way, the point's the same. If you're participating in a wedding, are you going to fast during that wedding? That would seem pretty inappropriate. You're there to rejoice and celebrate with the people getting married, and instead you're doing some religious, I can't eat today, I can't participate. Jesus' point is, look, there's a place for fasting. He even alludes to the fact that my own disciples will fast one day. When the Son of Man's taken away from them, they will fast. There's appropriate times for this, but then there's inappropriate times for it. Like, fasting has a purpose, but are you just doing it to do it? Or are you doing it because there's a real reason behind it? Is it just this routine and this ritual that you have built in because it shows how devoted you are? Or is there some meaningful purpose that you're trying to accomplish by having a fast? Because Jesus is saying, I'm accomplishing a purpose with what I'm doing. I'm partying with these people because I'm on mission. Are you on mission? Don't fast simply for the sake of fasting. Is it the right time for it? Is the purpose right? Doing good things for the wrong reason or at the wrong time is no longer a good thing. And that's kind of what Jesus is saying. Is that some things might appear good or they might have a good purpose in certain times, but just doing it for the sake of a tradition or of always doing it kind of loses its purpose. It's no longer a good thing, like doing it during a wedding. Then he goes on and he talks about the sort of change that he intends to bring about. As he comes, he says this. He says that he gives them 2 parables. He says, look, you can't take a new piece of cloth, of unshrunk cloth, and try to patch a garment that has a hole in it. Because what's going to happen? That cloth is going to naturally shrink, and when it does, it's going to tear away from the garment that was old and more brittle, and you're going to have an even bigger hole than you started with. Likewise, he says you can't take new wine that hasn't yet fermented and pour it into an old wineskin that's already stretched. So the wineskins were basically pouches sewn up, made from goat skin typically. And initially that leather is pliable and it'll stretch, and you can pour new wine into one, and then it will stretch out. But if you try later to take that already stretched wineskin and pour new wine into it and let it stretch out again, it's just going to burst, Jesus says, and you're going to ruin the wineskin and the new wine. So you have to put new wine in the new wineskin. Well, what's his point? These are metaphors. He's basically saying, well, the newness that I am bringing is not the kind of newness that you can just patch onto the old system. He's saying, look, I didn't come to conform myself to Judaism. I didn't even come to reform Judaism. I came to transform Judaism. You see, somebody who conforms is somebody who comes and they just go with the flow and do what's always been done. That would be taking the old wine in the old wineskin. That would be putting on the old garment with all of its holes and leaving it. That would be conforming. Jesus isn't doing that. Most expected that he came to reform it, to make tweaks, to basically keep the system in place, keep the foundations of the system in place, and just, make some basic tweaks to it. Jesus is saying, that's not why I came. That would be like taking a new cloth and putting it to patch an old garment. That doesn't work. He's saying the whole system itself, the foundations and the framework need to be replaced. And he's replacing them with himself. He is calling people to follow him, not some new system that he's bringing, not some tweaked rules, some tweaked regulations. Follow me. It's new wine in new wineskins. It's a new cloth altogether, a new garment altogether. His point is he's doing something completely different from before. Those who are trying desperately to hold on to the old system are going to be sorely disappointed because the system that the Pharisees and the religious leaders and the devout Jews, some of them, were fighting to protect and maintain was becoming obsolete. That's what the whole book of Hebrews is about. The old system has become obsolete. If you try to leave Jesus and then go back to the old system, there is no salvation in that. It's an obsolete system. Elsewhere, Jesus is going to talk about how even the temple itself, in judgment against it, that the temple which is being destroyed is going to be raised up in the form of his new body. That the new temple to worship in is Jesus, that he is replacing the system. And the church, which is the body of Jesus, becomes, in Paul's writings, the temple. It's no longer a building where you go through and worship according to an old system. So I believe Christians today, we have to be careful about basing too much on Old Testament law. There are some things in the Old Testament law that reflect universal morality, things that have always been true. Do not kill, do not commit adultery, honor your parents. There's plenty of moral truths in the Old Testament law that continue to be true. In fact, they were true before the law was codified and written down. But there's also many things that have been made obsolete. And we are first and foremost called to follow Jesus, a person, not a law code. And as I said several minutes ago, a better mark of religious piety isn't how well one conforms themselves to follow a set of rules like the food laws or festival days or religious rituals, but rather how well we love other people in the name of Jesus and how well we follow Jesus and listen to what he said. And I think by extension then, one step further, as Christians today, we have to be careful about our own religious traditions. Fighting too hard to maintain certain cultural or religious practices, even if they're no longer effective. It's like fasting for the sake of fasting, not because there's some purpose behind it that it's accomplishing. But it's just sort of a way for me to show my devotion to God. A way for me to continue doing something because it shows that I really love him because I sacrifice in this way. And I think God would say, well, sacrifice can be good, but I'm not really asked you to sacrifice just to sacrifice. I've really called you to love other people. And if your sacrifices get in the way of loving people well, then they really should be discarded. And so we always must weigh the value of our particular traditions, even those that we think are rooted in good logic or good intention, against God's heart for reaching people with the gospel. I just recently watched the movie Jesus Revolution, which came out about a year ago, surrounding the story of Pastor Chuck Smith, the Calvary Chapel Church movement, church in Costa Mesa, California. And I don't know how much of it was true to life. It was based on a true story. But in the story, he is challenged and confronted with the opportunity to welcome the hippies into his church. And you can imagine a lot of the well-established members of his church were very uncomfortable when the hippies started to come. They didn't dress like you would expect a committed Christian to dress. They didn't look and talk, and they certainly didn't sing the same songs that established Christians sang. And so, there was a lot of uncomfortable conversations that began to go on about, who are the givers here? You got to be careful who you appease, because you're going to chase away the givers in favor of these hippies. In one of the scenes in the movie in particular, some of the established members, it was maybe an elder in the church or a deacon or something, is having a conversation with Pastor Chuck, and they're saying, look, these people aren't even wearing shoes. They're coming in with dirty feet, and they're staining the new carpet. And so in a follow-up scene, again, I don't know if this actually happened or if this was just for movie, but Chuck sat at the door as the hippies were lined up to come in with a basin and a towel, washing their feet one at a time, inviting them in to appease the ones who were concerned about the dirty feet, while also showing love to the hippies. Eventually, that church grew. Today the Calvary Chapel movement is like over 1,000 churches, but Chuck Smith's church alone grew multiple thousands of people, largely because of the Jesus movement of the hippies who were finding that their old lifestyle of drugs and sex, and they were supposedly looking for peace and love, but they were looking in the wrong places, and their definition of peace and love had to be transformed. But through the gospel, it was for many of them. And these people that many had written off as too far gone, as they're not going to be interested in the gospel, their lifestyle's too far out there, they're not interested in church stuff. As one of the characters in the movie kind of helps the pastor, Chuck, to understand, look, when they're out there going for an LSD high, they're really looking for Jesus. They don't know it, but that's what they're looking for. They're looking for something transformative, some great experience. Help them find and help them see that it's actually Jesus that they're longing for. Matthew's telling a similar story. Jesus, as a man of God who comes down and he appeals himself to the down and outers. They're attracted to him. They see in him somebody who loves them, somebody who cares about them, someone who's willing to even associate with them, who's willing to get his carpet dirty by welcoming them in. Unfortunately, many of the established religious folks, the religious elites, they didn't have eyes to see Jesus because he was too unconventional. Again, the inconspicuous king. How could this guy be the king of Israel, the king of Judaism? He doesn't even respect so much of what Judaism has stood for so long. His life and ministry were so unconventional. I wonder if Jesus were to show up in our day and age today, what conventions would he violate of ours? What established practices would he simply ignore? What taboos would he commit? I have to imagine there's some. I have to imagine there are things that all of us do that we don't even really think about, that Jesus wouldn't have time for, wouldn't care for. Would you or I have eyes to see him and a heart that was willing to follow him wherever he led, even when he's violating our conventions? That's the question Matthew's gospel invites us to answer. That's the question I invite you to think about this week. Heavenly Father, Lord, I pray that you would help us to be able to evaluate our own religion, our own conventions, our own trappings, the things that either collectively as a church or individually or maybe as a family, things that we do and we assume that we do them as ways to show our love for you, but it's possible maybe that there's things that Jesus would have us reevaluate and even change, things that maybe aren't accomplishing as much as we assume that they are. Father, if there are ways for us to reach people in our community better, our own neighbors better, our own children better, if there are ways for us to reflect the heart of Jesus more, I pray that you would show them to us. Pray that you would reveal them to us as individuals and even collectively to us as a church, that we would first and foremost be known as followers of Jesus, those who love you, those who are willing to even be uncomfortable in order to be obedient to you, to do the things that you call us to do, that we would be like Matthew, who would leave behind the things in our life, the life of sin, the things that don't please you, the things that don't reflect your heart, that we would leave it behind quickly for the joy and the privilege of being your disciple. This we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.